On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Japan possessed the most powerful carrier fleet on Earth. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, the finest naval aviators in the world. Only 6 months earlier, they had devastated Pearl Harbor. Since then, they had conquered much of the Pacific. To many military leaders, their victory seemed inevitable. Then, in less than 5 minutes, everything changed. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers erupted into flames. Aircraft exploded across crowded flight decks. Fuel ignited. Bombs detonated. The most feared naval strike force in the world had been crippled before many of its crews even understood what was happening. It wasn't destroyed by battleships. It wasn't sunk by submarines. And it wasn't attacked by America's newest airplane. Instead, it was shattered by a slow dive bomber that many pilots considered old-fashioned. The Douglas SBD Dauntless. It wasn't fast. It wasn't glamorous. It couldn't even outrun most fighters of its time. But on one extraordinary morning, it accomplished something no aircraft in history had ever done. This is the story of the SBD Dauntless, the overlooked bomber that won the Battle of Midway in 5 minutes. When people think about the greatest aircraft of the Second World War, they usually picture fighters. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Zero. Fast machines locked in dramatic dogfights thousands of feet above the battlefield. Bombers receive attention too. The B-17, the Lancaster, the B-29. Massive aircraft capable of levelling entire cities. The Dauntless was neither. It occupied an awkward place between the two. It wasn't built to dominate the skies, and it wasn't built to flatten cities. It had only one purpose: destroy ships, one ship at a time. That might sound simple. It wasn't. Hitting a moving warship in the middle of the ocean was one of the hardest tasks in aviation. Imagine trying to throw a football into the bed of a pickup truck, while both you and the truck are moving, and someone is shooting at you. That's what naval bombing looked like in 1942. A bomb that landed 20 or 30 meters away could create a spectacular splash and do almost no damage. Against an aircraft carrier, near misses rarely decided battles. Direct hits did. The entire future of carrier warfare depended on accuracy. Most bombers attacked from level flight. They flew high above the target and released their bombs while flying straight. That worked against factories, railroads, cities. It didn't work very well against warships. Ships turned, accelerated, changed course. By the time the bomb reached the water, the target was often somewhere else. The US Navy needed something different, something far more precise. The answer was dive bombing. Instead of dropping bombs from several thousand feet while flying level, the pilot aimed the entire airplane directly at the target. The attack began almost vertically. The aircraft rolled onto its back. The nose pointed toward the sea. Then came the dive. Steeper, faster, closer. Every second, the target filled more of the windscreen. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from below. The pilot ignored it. He held the dive, held it longer, waited until the very last safe moment, released the bomb, then pulled back on the control column with every ounce of strength he had. Done correctly, the aircraft escaped. Done too late, the ocean arrived first. No airplane embraced that terrifying style of combat better than the Douglas SBD Dauntless. Its chief designer, Ed Heinemann, understood something many engineers overlooked. A naval dive bomber didn't need to be beautiful. It needed to be predictable, strong, reliable. Most importantly, it needed to put a bomb exactly where the pilot aimed it. Everything else came second. At first glance, the Dauntless didn't impress anyone. Its top speed barely exceeded 250 miles per hour. Its landing gear only partially retracted. Compared with sleek fighters entering service around the world, it looked almost outdated. Some pilots even joked that enemy fighters wouldn't have to chase it. They could simply wait for it. But appearances were deceptive, because hidden beneath that simple design were features that made the Dauntless exceptionally effective. The most distinctive were its perforated dive brakes. Large metal panels beneath the wings opened during the attack, creating enormous drag. Without them, gravity would accelerate the aircraft so quickly that pilots could lose control before releasing their bombs. The holes in the brakes solved another problem. Instead of shaking violently in the airflow, the aircraft remained remarkably stable. That stability gave pilots precious extra seconds to aim. And those few seconds often made the difference between a near miss and a direct hit. The Dauntless was also far tougher than it looked. Its all-metal construction could withstand the tremendous forces created during repeated dive attacks. Armour protected the crew. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the danger of fire. The rugged Wright R1820. Cyclone radial engine earned a reputation for reliability under some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Carrier operations punished aircraft every single day. Hard landings, salt water, rough weather, long patrols over open ocean. The Dauntless kept flying. Again and again and again. Its crews quickly learned something important. It wasn't an aircraft that impressed people sitting on the ground. It impressed the people whose lives depended on it. By late 1941, the Dauntless equipped the dive bomber squadrons aboard America's aircraft carriers. Its pilots trained relentlessly. Hour after hour, they practiced diving on moving targets. Every attack followed the same routine: roll, dive, aim, release, pull out, repeat. The goal wasn't simply hitting the target, it was making the sequence so automatic that the pilot could perform it while anti-aircraft shells burst all around him. Inside the Dauntless, the pilot and rear gunner were separated by only a few feet. Yet during an attack, they were almost fighting two different battles. The pilot looked forward, searching for the target, watching his altitude, judging his angle, waiting for the exact moment to release. Behind him, the gunner looked the other way. His job was to watch the sky the pilot couldn't see. Enemy fighters could appear from almost anywhere. And once the dive began, there was little time to react. The pilot rolled the Dauntless into its dive. The horizon disappeared, and suddenly, the ocean filled the windscreen. Thousands of feet below, the target looked almost impossibly small. Then it began to grow, slowly at first, then frighteningly fast. A carrier that had been little more than a shape on the ocean became a flight deck. Individual aircraft became visible. Gun positions, the ship's wake. And all the while, the Dauntless kept descending. This was the moment when training mattered most, because everything around the pilot was telling him to stop. Anti-aircraft shells burst through the formation. Tracer fire climbed toward the aircraft. The target grew larger with every second, and the ocean was getting closer. Pull out too early and the bomb might miss. Hold the dive too long and there might not be enough altitude left to recover. So the pilot kept going. He made small corrections, held the target in his sight, waited. Then, at the planned release point, the bomb fell away. But the attack still wasn't over. The pilot pulled back and the Dauntless curved violently away from the sea. His body became heavy under the force of the recovery. For several seconds, survival depended on altitude, speed, and whether the aircraft could absorb the punishment. Behind him, the rear gunner was already searching for fighters again. Then the crew climbed away and looked back. Only now would they discover whether those few terrifying seconds had been enough. Every instinct told the pilot to pull away. His training told him to keep going. And that was the difference, because when the moment finally came, there would be no time to think, only to react. No one knew just how important that training would soon become. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. In a matter of hours, the Pacific War changed forever. Japan suddenly controlled the initiative. Its carrier fleet appeared unstoppable. One Allied defeat followed another. Across the Pacific, confidence turned into desperation. America desperately needed a victory, but no one yet knew where that victory would come from. Ironically, it wouldn't be delivered by the Navy's fastest fighter or its largest warship. It would come from an airplane that almost everyone underestimated. Because 6 months later, high above a patch of empty ocean called Midway, the Dauntless would receive 5 minutes. That would change the course of the Second World War forever. By the spring of 1942, the Douglas SBD Dauntless had proven itself to be a capable dive bomber. Its pilots respected it. Its crews trusted it. Then came the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. It was the first naval battle in history in which the opposing fleets never saw one another. Everything depended on aircraft. American dive bombers located the Japanese light carrier Shoho. As the attack began, one pilot radioed a message that would become legendary. "Scratch one flat top." Within minutes, Shoho was sinking, the first Japanese carrier lost in the war. The Dauntless had shown exactly what accurate dive bombing could do. But Coral Sea came at a price. Japanese aircraft crippled the American carrier USS Lexington, which had to be abandoned and scuttled. The battle ended without a clear winner. Yet strategically, it mattered enormously. 2 of Japan's fleet carriers were damaged badly enough that they couldn't join the next operation. A battle that seemed inconclusive would soon help shape the course of history. But it had yet to fight the battle that would define its legacy. That battle was already taking shape, and it began not in the skies, but in a room filled with Codebreakers. While Japanese carriers continued their seemingly unstoppable advance across the Pacific, a small team of American cryptanalysts worked around the clock beneath the headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, they spent months trying to decipher Japanese naval communications. Slowly, fragments of information began coming together. The Japanese were planning a major operation against a target identified only as AF. But what was AF? Some believed it was Hawaii. Others suspected a different island. No one could be certain. Rochefort believed it was Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost lying more than 1,000 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. His superiors wanted proof. So the Americans devised one of the cleverest intelligence tricks of the war. Midway transmitted an unencrypted radio message claiming its water purification system had broken down. A short time later, Japanese communications reported that AF is short of water. The mystery was solved. The Americans now knew exactly where Japan intended to strike. More importantly, they knew when. Admiral Chester Nimitz suddenly possessed something priceless: information. Instead of reacting to Japan's attack, he could prepare for it. It was an extraordinary opportunity. America still had fewer carriers, fewer experienced pilots, and fewer aircraft than Japan. But if Nimitz positioned his fleet correctly, surprise could outweigh numbers. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, quietly sailed toward a point northeast of Midway. Their mission wasn't simply to defend the island, it was to ambush the most powerful carrier fleet on Earth. The Japanese had no idea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed the Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor. His plan depended on that assumption. The attack on Midway would lure the remaining American carriers into battle. Once they appeared, Japan's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would destroy them. It seemed like the perfect trap. The only problem, the trap had already been reversed. As the Japanese fleet approached Midway in early June, confidence remained high. These weren't ordinary carriers. Together, they had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had supported the invasions of Southeast Asia. They had crushed Allied naval resistance across the Pacific. Their pilots represented the finest naval aviators in the world. Many had years of combat experience. Across the fleet, victory felt almost inevitable. Few believed the Americans possessed either the strength or the courage to challenge them. The American crews felt very differently. They knew exactly how dangerous the coming battle would be. Many of the Dauntless pilots had already seen what Japanese carrier aviation could do. They had watched ships burn, friends disappear beneath the ocean, entire squadrons wiped out in minutes. They respected their enemy, but unlike 6 months earlier, they no longer feared him. They trusted their aircraft, and they trusted their training. For Dauntless crews, months of relentless practice had led to this moment. Every dive they had flown, every simulated attack, every difficult carrier landing, every bomb dropped on practice ranges. It all came down to one simple objective: find the enemy carriers. Because in carrier warfare, everything depended on that first discovery. You couldn't sink what you couldn't find. The Pacific Ocean covered more than 60 million square miles. Somewhere within that vast expanse, 2 carrier fleets were searching desperately for one another. Whoever located the enemy first would likely launch the first strike, and history had already shown what the first strike could accomplish. Pearl Harbor had proven that. Before sunrise on June 4, 1942, both fleets launched scout aircraft. Pilots disappeared over the horizon in every direction. Hour after hour, they searched empty ocean. Nothing. Nothing. Still nothing. Then, shortly after dawn, Japanese aircraft reached Midway. Bombs exploded across the island. Runways were damaged. Buildings burned. But Midway's defenders weren't finished. American Marine fighters scrambled into the air. Army bombers attacked the Japanese fleet. Torpedo bombers followed. Then came B-17 flying fortresses. One after another, American aircraft launched desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers. They achieved almost nothing. Bombs missed. Torpedoes failed. Entire formations were shot down. From the Japanese perspective, the battle seemed to be unfolding exactly as expected. Yet those attacks accomplished something no one immediately recognized. Every new wave forced Japanese fighters lower and lower. Combat air patrols chased torpedo bombers almost down to sea level. Anti-aircraft guns fired continuously. The fleet maneuvered violently to avoid incoming attacks. The Japanese carriers became increasingly disorganized. No one aboard realized just how vulnerable they had become. At 10:20 a.m. on June 4, 1942, history balanced on a single decision. High above the Pacific, the Dauntless squadrons from USS Enterprise had been searching for nearly an hour. Fuel was running low. The ocean below seemed endless. Some pilots wondered if they had missed the Japanese fleet entirely. Turning back meant safety. Continuing meant risking everything. Then one man made the decision that changed the war. Commander Clarence McCluskey refused to give up. Instead of ordering his aircraft home, he noticed something below: a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi. It was racing through the water at full speed. McCluskey realized there was only one reason for that. The destroyer was trying to rejoin the main fleet. He banked his Dauntless and followed it. Sometimes history changes because of overwhelming force, sometimes because of brilliant strategy, and sometimes because one pilot trusted his instincts. A few minutes later, the impossible happened. There they were, 4 Japanese fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the very ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Below them, the Japanese fleet appeared calm, but appearances were deceiving. The carriers were in the middle of organized chaos. Throughout the morning, wave after wave of American aircraft had attacked. Midway-based bombers, Marine fighters, Army B-17 bombers, and finally, slow TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Almost every attack had failed. Many American crews had paid with their lives. The Devastators suffered especially terrible losses. Flying low and slow, they became easy targets for Japanese fighters. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Only a handful of aircraft survived. At first glance, their sacrifice seemed meaningless. It wasn't. The relentless attacks had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. 0 fighters were scattered far below the carriers, chasing the last American torpedo bombers. Meanwhile, Admiral Chuichi Nagamo faced an impossible situation. His reserve aircraft had originally been armed for another strike against Midway. Then came reports of American ships. Bombs were removed, torpedoes loaded. Then new reports arrived suggesting another change. Ground crews worked frantically. Fuel hoses snaked across hangar decks. Bombs lay stacked beside aircraft. Torpedoes waited to be loaded. The carriers had become floating warehouses filled with fuel, ammunition, and armed airplanes. One bomb placed in exactly the right spot could trigger catastrophe. Then lookouts looked up. High above them, American dive bombers. The Dauntlesses had arrived completely unnoticed. There was no time to organise a proper defence. No time to recover the fighters circling thousands of feet below. No time to prepare. The American pilots rolled their aircraft onto their backs. Dive brakes opened. The familiar vibration filled the cockpit. The sea rushed upward. The carriers grew larger with every passing second. Anti-aircraft shells burst around them. No one turned away. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best selected the flagship Akagi. Other Enterprise Dauntlesses chose Kaga. Pilots from USS Yorktown locked onto Soryu. For several breathtaking seconds, every pilot focused on the same task. Hold the dive, ignore the explosions, ignore the gunfire. Wait, now. Bombs separated from the aircraft one after another. The Dauntlesses pulled violently out of their dives. Behind them, history exploded. Kaga was hit first. Bombs smashed through the flight deck and detonated among aircraft preparing for launch. Fuel ignited instantly. Explosions ripped through the hangar. Flames spread from one end of the ship to the other. Within moments, one of Japan's greatest carriers had become an uncontrollable inferno. Almost simultaneously, Soryu suffered multiple devastating hits. Fire raced through the enclosed hangar decks. Ammunition exploded. Crew members fought desperately to contain the flames. It was hopeless. The ship had suffered fatal damage in only minutes. Then came Akagi. Remarkably, only a single bomb struck the flagship, but it landed almost perfectly. It penetrated the flight deck before exploding among fueled and armed aircraft below. The blast ignited aviation fuel. Bombs and torpedoes detonated in rapid succession. Within minutes, the flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was burning beyond saving. One perfectly placed bomb had destroyed the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Less than 5 minutes after the first Dauntless rolled into its dive, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. 3 carriers. Destroyed, in 5 minutes. It remains one of the most extraordinary reversals in military history. An operation that had begun with Japan expecting another overwhelming victory had become a disaster almost beyond comprehension. But the battle wasn't over. One carrier remained, Hiryu. Its air group escaped the initial attack and launched a determined counterstrike. Japanese dive bombers soon found the American carrier USS Yorktown. Bombs slammed into the flight deck. Fires broke out. Smoke poured into the sky. Yet the damage control crews aboard Yorktown performed what many historians still consider one of the greatest feats in naval history. Within hours, the carrier appeared operational once again. Japanese pilots couldn't believe it. Convinced they had found a second American carrier, they launched another attack. In reality, they were attacking the same ship. This time, torpedoes struck home. Yorktown lost power and began to list heavily. Although many of her crew survived, the proud carrier would never return to battle. The Americans answered quickly. Scout aircraft located Hiryu late that afternoon. Once again, Dauntless squadrons climbed into position. Once again, dive breaks opened. Once again, pilots committed themselves to near vertical dives. Bomb after bomb struck the final Japanese carrier. Massive fires swept through the ship. By nightfall, all 4 carriers that had carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor had been destroyed or fatally damaged. In a single day, Japan lost the heart of its carrier fleet. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences had only begun. The Dauntless had done far more than sink ships. It had shattered Japan's offensive power in the Pacific. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of the story wasn't how the Dauntless won the battle. It was that an aircraft so often overlooked, so often overshadowed by faster fighters and larger bombers, would quietly go on to become one of the most successful naval bombers of the entire Second World War. And the numbers behind its combat record are even more astonishing than those 5 unforgettable minutes. When the Battle of Midway ended, the world looked very different than it had that morning. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Along with them went hundreds of aircraft, hundreds of veteran pilots, experienced mechanics, flight deck crews, and years of irreplaceable combat experience. Ships could eventually be rebuilt. Airplanes could be manufactured. But the men who knew how to fight and win carrier battles could not. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was no longer advancing. From Midway onward, it would spend the rest of the war fighting a defensive campaign. And one overlooked dive bomber had played the decisive role. The remarkable thing about the Dauntless is that it never looked like a war-winning aircraft. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't especially fast. Its top speed of just over 250 miles per hour already seemed outdated by 1942. Compared to fighters like the Zero or the Spitfire, it appeared slow and almost old-fashioned. Yet the Dauntless proved a lesson that military planners still study today. The fastest aircraft doesn't always win battles. The one that arrives at exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, often does. At Midway, accuracy defeated speed. Training defeated reputation. Preparation defeated confidence. The Dauntless didn't disappear after Midway. In many ways, its hardest work was still ahead. Only 2 months later, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning one of the longest and bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. Once again, Dauntless crews launched day after day, sometimes from aircraft carriers, sometimes from rough jungle airstrips carved into coral and mud. They attacked troop transports bringing Japanese reinforcements. They struck cruisers and destroyers attempting nighttime supply runs. They bombed artillery positions threatening American Marines ashore. Every successful dive made life harder for Japanese forces fighting across the Solomon Islands. The Dauntless had become much more than a carrier bomber. It had become one of the Navy's most dependable weapons. But Guadalcanal showed a very different side of the Dauntless. Midway had been decided in minutes. Guadalcanal would grind on for months, and this time there would be no single perfect attack to end the battle. For Dauntless crews operating from Henderson Field, the war became a daily struggle. The airfield itself sat in the middle of a battlefield. Japanese aircraft bombed it. Warships shelled it. Tropical rain turned parts of the surrounding ground into mud. Maintenance crews worked under primitive conditions to keep damaged aircraft flying. There were no comfortable bases far behind the front. The enemy was often only miles away. And every aircraft mattered. The conditions punished machines almost as much as they punished men. Heat, humidity, dust, and constant operations placed enormous strain on aircraft and crews alike. Spare parts could be difficult to obtain, forcing ground crews to make the most of whatever they had available. A damaged Dauntless wasn't just another aircraft waiting for repair. It might be needed again the very next day. And sometimes, keeping one aircraft flying meant taking usable parts from another that could no longer be saved. Keeping them in the air became a battle of its own. Mechanics patched holes, repaired engines, replaced damaged components, and prepared the aircraft to fly again, sometimes within hours. Then another mission came. Japanese forces depended heavily on ships to move men, ammunition and supplies through the Solomon Islands. Destroy those ships, and the troops fighting on Guadalcanal became harder to reinforce. That made almost anything moving through the surrounding waters a potential target. Transports, cargo ships, cruisers, destroyers. Dauntless crews took off, climbed over the island, and headed out across the ocean searching for them. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found exactly what they were looking for. And then the routine began again. Roll, dive, aim, release, pull out. The same sequence crews had practiced long before the war. Except now, there was no training range beneath them. There were Japanese ships firing back. And if the Dauntless survived the attack, its crew still had to find their way back to an airfield that might itself be under attack. This wasn't the kind of battle that created one legendary 5-minute moment. It was exhausting, repetitive, relentless. And that was exactly where the Dauntless proved what kind of aircraft it really was. Not because it was the fastest, not because it carried the largest bomb load, but because crews could depend on it to fly the mission, return, be repaired, and go back out again. Midway had shown what the Dauntless could accomplish in 5 minutes. Guadalcanal showed what it could accomplish when those 5 minutes became weeks, and then months. It wasn't glamorous, it simply kept flying. Its combat record continued to grow. By the end of the war, the SBD Dauntless had participated in nearly every major carrier battle of the Pacific. Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea. Again and again, it proved that precision could accomplish what overwhelming firepower sometimes could not. In total, Dauntless crews were credited with sinking 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, along with cruisers, destroyers, transports, and countless smaller vessels. No Allied aircraft sank more enemy shipping during the Second World War. For an airplane that rarely appears on lists of history's greatest combat aircraft, that achievement is extraordinary. Eventually, newer aircraft entered service. The Navy introduced the Curtiss SB-2, a Helldiver, as the Dauntless's replacement. On paper, it offered better performance, higher speed, greater bomb capacity, longer range. But many pilots remained loyal to the Dauntless. It wasn't because the older aircraft was faster, it wasn't. It wasn't because it carried more bombs. It didn't. They trusted it because it had earned that trust. It was predictable, reliable, forgiving. When a pilot rolled into a near-vertical dive with anti-aircraft fire exploding all around him, confidence in the aircraft mattered more than an extra 20 or 30 miles per hour. The Dauntless gave its crews that confidence every single time. Looking back, it's remarkable how often the Dauntless is overlooked. When people discuss the greatest aircraft of World War II, the conversation usually turns to fighters, the Mustang, the Spitfire, the Zero, or giant bombers like the Lancaster and the B-29. Rarely does anyone mention the SBD Dauntless, yet without it, Midway might have ended very differently. And if Midway had ended differently, the entire Pacific War could have taken another course. Sometimes history isn't changed by the aircraft with the highest top speed or the biggest bomb load. Sometimes it's changed by an aircraft that performs one mission almost perfectly. That was the Dauntless. It wasn't designed to impress people. It was designed to put a bomb exactly where it needed to go. And on June 4th, 1942, that was enough to change the world. Today, only a handful of Dauntless bombers still exist in museums and flying collections. They stand as reminders of an aircraft that never sought the spotlight. It simply did its job. Again. And again. Until one morning over the Pacific, 5 unforgettable minutes changed the course of the Second World War. The Douglas SBD Dauntless wasn't America's fastest bomber. It wasn't America's most advanced bomber. It wasn't even America's most famous bomber. But when history asked for one perfect attack, it delivered one of the greatest in aviation history. And that's why, more than 80 years later, its story still deserves to be told. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more deep dives into the aircraft, engineering breakthroughs, and untold missions that shaped World War II, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next video. And I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. Do you think the SBD Dauntless was the most underrated aircraft of World War II? Or is there another overlooked aircraft that deserves that title? I read as many of your comments as I can, and your suggestions often inspire future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.